Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's fourth space. Thank you for joining us for today's event, Honoring Truth, Reflecting on Impact. It's a day of learning with three-part events, and the first today, residential schools, history, research, and settler-colonial legacies. And we would like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, and we respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future, and our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. And here at Fourth Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge by co-creating daily activities that examine research questions and projects, things happening across the university. We're running today's event as a live stream to both YouTube and via Zoom. For those of you joining us via Zoom, we do welcome your comments and your questions via the chat. And for those of you here in the space, if you have time for some questions at the end, just raise your hand. We'll run a microphone over to you. With that, it's very much my pleasure now to pass the microphone over to the Senior Director of Indigenous Directions, Manon Tremblay. Manon, good morning.
It's my pleasure and honor to be able to welcome you all this morning to our event, which is looking at truth, reconciliation, 10 years after the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. We're examining basically, what have we done, what has not been done, what remains to be done. And we're also looking at this in the context of this morning, in the context of Concordia, in the context of us as Indigenous people in the wider community. And so we're very happy to be able to bring this to you. Now, some of you might wonder why September 16th and not September 30th? Why are we doing this so early? Well, there's a few reasons. The first one is, of course, availability of space. But there's also, because there is a belief among some of us that September 30th is a day where Indigenous people should have the freedom to take the day off and be in their own communities if they choose to do so. We don't feel that it is our role necessarily to entertain the university on September 30th. And we simply wanted to be able to also not compete with other special activities that are happening during that day. So I wanted to take this opportunity before we start with our first panel of the day to introduce to you our elders. You beat me to it, Delbert. I was going to introduce you before you started, but all the same, I think that it's important because you'll notice that our elders will be with us the entire day, and they will be participating in some of our panels, because I think that their perspective is very important as well in the truth and reconciliation. So I want to introduce you to Jean Stevenson and Delbert Sampson, who are cherished elders in the Montreal community and have been so for many, many years. Jean is Cree. She's from the Peguis First Nation in Manitoba, and she has a master's degree in social work from McGill University. And she is, as I am, an intergenerational survivor of residential schools. Her mom is a survivor of the Brandon Residential School. Delbert is Shuswap. He's from Salmon Arm, British Columbia. And he is himself a residential school survivor from the Kamloops School. He's trained as an addictions counselor. In 1992, they both started working together with Indigenous people, facilitating weekly healing circles. And for the last 25 years, they worked in federal institutions where they facilitated ceremonies for incarcerated Indigenous people. So they currently provide weekly elder services to the Justice Center of Montreal, and they provide spiritual support and guidance to the wider Indigenous community in Montreal. They believe in the power of healing through culture and ceremony, and I hope that you will join me in giving them a warm welcome amongst us today. And now, without any further ado, I'm going to pass this microphone over, or actually I think you're already wired, to Sigwan Thivierge, one of our professors here at Concordia, who will, I'm sure, introduce yourself a lot better than I could, and we'll get to the first panel going. Thank you.
I think I'm audible. Okay, I can hear myself pretty well, so I hope you can hear me. First of all, kichimigwech, everyone for coming, and for everyone who had a hand or contributed to creating this space for all of us to come together and have this discussion and this conversation in a good way. And so thank you for opening. Thank you again for just being here and showing up for all of us who are taking part in this event together. And also thank you for all of our panelists who are coming to share your knowledge with us and your perspectives with us also. And so I'll just begin by introducing myself. Sigwan Thivierge, Indigenous, Anishinaabe. So I'm Algonquin Anishinaabe from Long Point First Nation in Winnoway, which is about 600 kilometers northwest of here. I'm also full-time faculty here at Concordia. I'm in both First People Studies program and in our linguistics program here too. And so you kind of get a sense of where I am and where I'm coming from. My work is very broadly based in language reclamation, right at the intersection, I hope I'm working towards, at the intersection of theoretical linguistics and language learning. And all of this, my goal is to work towards serving my community and my nation, to bring our language back. And so this work and this conversation that's going to happen here today, that has been happening for a while now, it's very important to me, both as a person, as a faculty, just as a human, because my grandfather is a survivor of the residential school system as well, and my grandmother was forced to attend day schools. And so I feel the effects within my own family, within my own life, and as with many, many people, children who survive these systems, neither of my grandparents, even though they're still first language speakers of Anishinaabe, they never pass it along to their children, they never pass it along to me. And it's because of these forced placements into these settler-colonial institutions. And so this history, it affects me still today. It affects my family, and I'm not the only one, right? There's thousands of us who live in these experiences, who live with these stories still within our daily lives. And so I'm happy that we're all here today because we are sharing these stories together, but I think we're also working towards writing a new chapter, specifically here at Concordia, as we'll hear in a second from the panelists, the history that's grounded here in this particular part of the land, of the island. And so with my introduction, I'll now turn towards introducing all of our great researchers and great speakers here. I'll start with Colby Gaudet, who is joining us via Zoom. Hi, Colby. And so Colby is a cultural historian. He's currently a Shirk postdoc fellow at the Department of History at Dalhousie University. He works primarily with archives and literary sources and studies histories of religion, empire, and colonialism in North America and Turtle Island. And his research questions employ religion to analyze intercultural relations in the colonial Americas, with specializations in Atlantic slavery, gender, humanitarianism, and indigenous settler treaties. Sorry. And so we'll hear from Colby first, and then following Colby, we'll hear from Ellen Dobrowolski, who is a doctoral student here at Concordia University in the Department of Religions and Cultures. She's a member of the Métis Nation BC, and their family network spreads across the Métis homeland. And her doctoral project, Missionary and Métis, Unsettling Conceptions of the Ethnic and Religious Identities of Sara Riel. It investigates the life and works of Sara Riel, the first Métis Grey Nun missionary. And Ellen's research celebrates Indigenous histories and historical figures and highlights Indigenous research paradigms that center and privilege Indigenous experiences of religion and onto epistemologies. Following Ellen, we'll hear from Peter Gossage, who is a professor here at Concordia as well in the Department of History. He's a social historian of 19th and 20th century Quebec, where his main research areas are family, gender, population, and the law. And he has written a lot of things, lots of things. So, for example, just to highlight a couple of his works, he is co-author with J.I. Little of an illustrated history, sorry, of Quebec, Tradition and Modernity, which was published in 2012 by Oxford University Press. And more recently, he was co-editor, along with Lisa Moore, of the Family and Justice in the Archives, Historical Perspectives on Intimacy and the Law. And this was published by Concordia University Press last year in 2024. Following Peter, we'll hear from VK Preston and two of their students. So VK is an artist and cultural historian. Their work attends to danceways, movements, traversing histories of community, record-making, embodiment, and cultural violence. VK works closely with primary resources, focusing on embodied ways of knowing and practices, foregrounding lived epistemic distinctions, including long histories of capital, gender, race, ecology, intimacy, and sovereignty. The two students who will be presenting and talking with VK Preston is Leah Hussein, who's a history student and had the pleasure of working with over a oral history institute earlier this summer. Very happy to see you again. And she's a history student, a writer, and a former chef instructor. And her particular interests are food and culture, colonization, and migration and immigration in the Americas. And then we'll also hear from Emma McLean, who's a multidisciplinary artist currently living and working in Jojage, Munyang, or Montreal. And so as an artist and historian, she uses archival research to explore the relationship between utilitarian fiber practices and the significance of women's work in the development of social infrastructure. She is currently completing her master's degree, also here at Concordia, in history, where she's engaged in archival research regarding the Grey Nuns' impact on concepts of femininity. I'm a linguist, can't speak. Anyway, so femininity and motherhood within Indigenous and settler communities. I'll also introduce two students who couldn't be here with us today. Their names are Catherine Ottawa Naquato and Portia Madeleine Eva Lafonde, whose Cree name is Onochinekine Pikwesio. I'm sure I messed that up. I'm sorry for that. So they couldn't be here, but I'll introduce them anyway because they are sharing a video with us based on their work with involving around the Grey Nuns building as well. And so Catherine is a student here at Concordia. She's a Tikamek from Manon. She's in her first year of film production at Mel Oppenheim School of Cinema here. And her work really focuses on storytelling as a means of cultural preservation specifically, and more importantly, about sharing Indigenous perspectives through film. And then finally for Portia, she's a recent graduate of Concordia University. Both of you students, I have met them both. They are both amazing people who have a lot to say as well. And Portia did her BA in First People Studies here. She just finished. And she's now a master's student also. She's way out at the University of Saskatchewan, where she's in the Indigenous Studies department over there. And she's focusing on Cree protocols of repatriating sacred and ancestral items within museums and institutions. And so her work is driven by a deep passion for decolonizing spaces where colonial harm has left its legacy. And so I'm really excited to hear everyone here speak on their work here today. We have about an hour or so for panel presentations, about 10 to 15 minutes each. And then after we've heard from everyone, and then we'll open it up to the audience for a wider conversation and a wider discussion. And so I'll hand it off here to Colby. And so take it away.
Good morning, everyone. My sound is coming in okay? You can hear me? Great. Thank you, Sigwan, for your introduction. Thank you, everyone, for your presence this morning and your attention. I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint here. So just some prefatory remarks. First, my presentation contains images and documents from the Jesuit archives pertaining to the residential school that the Jesuits operated in rural Ontario. And the photograph collection itself from the residential school contains over 3,000 images that were recently cataloged and digitized. Second, the information that I'll be presenting is based on the research for a report that I was commissioned to complete for Concordia's Indigenous Directions Office, which itself was a fulfillment of an item on the Indigenous Directions Action Plan of 2019, which included a call for research to be done about the colonial history of Concordia's founding and partner institutions. So today I'll address connections between Loyola College, which was one of our founding institutions, and the Spanish Indian Residential School in Ontario. Many of you perhaps know that it was Loyola College that merged with Sir George Williams University to create Concordia in 1974. So we've just passed our 50th birthday. This history, of course, is very present for us Concordians, as Loyola is still the name of one of Concordia's two campuses today, so a part of our everyday campus life and activity. So here you'll see the administration building of Loyola College from the early 20th century. It's recognizable to those of you who visited the Loyola campus. Loyola College was established by the Jesuit Order of Priests in 1896 with the NDG property obtained in 1900, and the campus and its neo-Gothic buildings opened between 1911 and 1913. This date of 1913 is important because it was also the year the Canadian Jesuits launched their residential school in a community known as Spanish River on the north shore of Georgian Bay, opposite of Manitoulin Island. This residential school was named St. Peter Clavers after a Jesuit saint and was operated by the Jesuits and funded by the Canadian federal government. There was also a girls' residential school on the same site, which was operated by a congregation of Catholic nuns. And collectively, the schools were known simply as Spanish. And you can see the two schools in the photograph on the bottom right. On the left, you can see the boys' school in its early days. And the date of the second photograph is 1937. The schools at Spanish were themselves outgrowths of the Jesuits' earlier mission school at Wigwamacong on Manitoulin Island that itself dated to the 1850s and was largely staffed by Jesuits out of Montreal. By the early 20th century, Ottawa's Department of Indian Affairs mandated that the Jesuits' residential school be relocated from the island to the mainland to accomplish two goals. First, to remove children from their reserved community on Manitoulin, and two, to make the school accessible to Indigenous students from Eastern Ontario and Quebec who would be sent by the government to attend the school, thus removing these students from their home communities as well. In 1947, the Jesuits expanded the scope of the residential school, opening a residential high school, the first of its kind in the country. Named after another Jesuit saint, Charles Garnier, the high school was for senior boys and girls, with the intention that Garnier would prepare potential Indigenous students to go on to Canadian universities and colleges, thus enfranchising them. And indeed, some students from Garnier went on to attend such colleges, including the former Ryerson in Toronto and Loyola College here in Montreal in the 1950s. I say here in Montreal as if I am still in Montreal. I'm no longer in Montreal, I'm in Halifax. Sorry, in those moved about 2 months ago. Anyway, my apologies. The boys' school at Spanish operated until 1958 when the Jesuits decided to close the operation. The girls' school, however, closed in 1962, operated a few years longer. Something I want to underline for Concordians is that Jesuits from Loyola College worked at the residential school as part of their career development, including several principals of Spanish who themselves were either former students and or teachers at Loyola College and Loyola High School. These men, I have their dates and some of their biography noted on the screen there, included Victor Gravel, James Howitt, Edward Leo Burns, and William James Kearns, each of whom had either trained as students at Loyola or were else instructors there, or sometimes both. Gravel was an instructor at Loyola in the early 20th century and went on to become a principal of Spanish. Howitt taught at Loyola from 1918 to 22, and he was a principal of Spanish twice in the early 30s and in the later 30s. And then Edward Leo Burns was educated as a boy at Loyola in the early 20th century. He was a professor of religion and philosophy at Loyola and then became principal rather, of Spanish in the 1950s. And then lastly, William James Kearns taught at Loyola and was the final principal of Spanish in 1957, and he was responsible for making the decision to close the boys' school in 1958. These are documents from 1957 outlining the student demographics at Spanish, including their communities of origin. These numbers represent only the boys and were compiled by the Jesuits as part of their decision-making process about the fate of the school. As you can see, the students were taken from over a dozen different Indigenous communities covering a vast geography in Ontario and Quebec, from Fort Frances and Sault Ste. Marie in the west to Kahnawake and Akwesasne in the east. The numbers are also arranged by the respective agencies of the Department of Indian Affairs, reflecting the ties between the church and state officials. Importantly, we do have published accounts in the form of memoirs written by student survivors of the Spanish schools. Basil Johnston was a graduate of Garnier. He published his experience there in his memoir titled Indian School Days from 1988. He described life at Spanish as a sentencing. He says their daily routine was strictly regulated. Students were often punished by the Jesuits. Johnston was one of the Garnier graduates who came to Loyola College, where he completed a BA, his Loyola graduation photograph there from 1954, and he went on to become an acclaimed author. Cecil King, another survivor of Spanish, published recently in 2022 an account of his time at the residential school. He afterwards went on to have an active life in Indigenous politics and education policy development. And his book, The Boy from Buzwa, which is his community of origin on Manitoulin Island, is an important document for this case, and I highly recommend it. And both of these books are available to you in Concordia's Webster Library. In his memoir, Johnston talks about how the boys' sports teams at Spanish were one of the only places he was able to feel a sense of solidarity with his fellow Indigenous students, and in a sense, if only momentarily, escape the oppression of the classroom. This is an image that I found in the Jesuit archives of the Garnier High School baseball team in the early 1950s. The image isn't labeled on the back, but I do believe the young man on the left is Basil Johnston, just based on other photographs I've seen of him from the time. So really, that's a very brief overview of some of the connections between Loyola College and the Spanish residential school in Ontario, connections that took some Loyola instructors from Montreal to the residential school at Spanish, and in a few cases that brought students of Spanish to study here in Montreal at Loyola College. And then just to conclude on the note of truth-telling, this is a book I was reading over the weekend, and I was struck by how relevant it is to the conversation I expected us to be having today. So I want to share some thoughts from a theologian working at Fordham University in New York on the subject of transhistorical healing. Janine Hill Fletcher is a Roman Catholic theologian, and she considers reparation at Catholic colleges and universities with historical ties to slavery in the context of the United States. She especially analyzes the history of US Jesuit colleges, such as Georgetown and Fordham, and the relevance to us, Concordians, I mean, is that Fordham had notable ties to the Jesuit college here in Montreal in the mid-19th century. In my research, I found that there was a significant amount of exchange of professors and students between these two Jesuit colleges, what would become St. Mary's College in Montreal, and later Loyola College, and St. John's College, what would later become Fordham in New York. In the US context, Fletcher writes, quote, "The turn to history is for the purpose of a truth-telling that might foster an analysis that could lead to releasing the pain of historical trauma and ultimately to transformation." She continues that the Catholic Church in America, and I'm arguing Canada too, is a capital-rich institution with resources for telling a more complete history to fulfill our aim of truth-telling and analysis. Fletcher asks, could church institutions, which she includes schools and colleges in that category of church institutions, including their archives, could they leverage their privileged capital, quote, by helping increase access to these resources in order to help undertake the truth-telling required in the process of national healing from historical trauma? So I'll end on that note. I look forward to discussing these topics further, answering any questions about the Spanish residential school and the research that I've done. So I'll end there. And I believe Ellen was the next in our, or perhaps it was Peter Gossage, I don't recall, but I'll let you all take it from there. Thank you all.
I think it is me, right?
It is.
Sorry about
It is you,
yeah.
Peter. Sorry for
No
confusing
worries,
everyone.
no worries. And so I did have a PowerPoint, and I think that's probably all set to go. So I'll just start by saying that my comments have a particular framework, and the framework for the comments I'll make is the chapter I contributed to a book that was published last year in celebration of Concordia's 50th anniversary. And the chapter is called The Grey Nuns Mother House, Confronting the Difficult Legacies. I wanted to say a bit about how I got there, how I came to write that chapter. So I'm a settler scholar from Montreal, Tiohtià:ke. I grew up here. I did 2 history degrees at McGill in the 70s and 80s, and my MA thesis was a critical examination of the Grey Nuns and their work with abandoned children in the 19th century. After that, I did a PhD at UQAM in Quebec social history, and then I taught at the Université de Sherbrooke for 16 years before moving to Concordia in 2009. And none of my projects in any of that period, my UQAM and Sherbrooke years, had anything to do with the Grey Nuns, let alone with colonialism. But since Concordia had acquired the Mother House in 2007, two years before I got here, and since that is literally where my journey as an historian began, I walked through the entrance on Guy Street to ask about their archives and spoke to a nun who directed me to the archivist. I developed a strong interest. My interest in the history of the Grey Nuns was rekindled. And I took every opportunity I could to talk about the Grey Nuns, about the Grey Nuns building. I even spent a sabbatical year in a little office in the west wing of the Grey Nuns Mother House near the daycare. And so, but for me, there was a real turning point, and it's appropriate there were 10 years since the publication of the Truth and Reconciliation final report. In the section of the TRC report dealing with the early history of the residential school system, the Grey Nuns are mentioned between 65 and 70 times. Oblate missionaries, as many of you know, ran most of the Catholic schools, but they relied heavily on the unpaid labor of women's religious congregations, and their preferred partners, and that's a quote from the TRC report, were the Grey Nuns of Montreal. Honestly, and this is just me, this was news to me in 2015, although it probably shouldn't have been. I knew quite a bit about the Grey Nuns' work with poor and marginalized people in industrializing Montreal, work that was problematic on several levels, as I argued in my MA thesis. But I didn't know they had been so deeply involved in the mission to colonize and convert Indigenous people in the West and the North. So for the past 10 years, I've been actively working, not full-time, I've got other projects, but I've been actively working to fill in that gap in my own knowledge, documenting the Grey Nuns' participation as teachers, staff, and administrators in the operation of at least 19 residential schools across Turtle Island over a period of more than 125 years. So for the Concordia anniversary volume, I wanted to contribute something that would encourage conversations around the difficult legacies that our university inherited when we bought the Mother House for $18 million in 2007. And the text itself has 2 main parts. First, I tell the story of Concordia's acquisition of the building in as much detail as I could. And it's an interesting story with some twists and turns, especially after May 2006, when public health officials rejected the Grey Nuns application to have human remains exhumed from the crypt beneath the Mother House. And most of those graves are still there, by the way, which is something we'll hear more about from Emma McLean a little bit later. In the second part of the chapter, I try to describe in the space of a few pages the nature and scale of the Grey Nuns' involvement in Canada's genocidal system of Indian residential schools. My starting point for that research was a set of 19 narratives about individual schools that the Grey Nuns archivist Mylène Laurando had shared with me somewhat reluctantly, I will say, in 2020. I've cross-referenced those accounts with written records, photographs, and oral testimony collected by the TRC and available on the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation website. And this is really a huge amount of material. It's a tremendously valuable legacy of the Commission's work. And for me, it's just a lot, and more research, so much more research needs to be done. So a useful way forward, and it's something I encourage my students to do, is to focus on individual schools. And so that's what I'll do for a couple of minutes now. The Grey Nuns were active, for instance, for almost 90 years at the Capel Roman Catholic Industrial School in LeBret, Saskatchewan. Established in 1884, this school was rebuilt twice after being destroyed by fire in 1904 and 1932. It continued operating until 1998 as a federally sanctioned boarding school, eventually under full Indigenous control. During the 1902, to go way back, I guess, 15 years after its founding, there were 100 boys and 121 girls in attendance. The curriculum was focused on manual skills, including farming, blacksmithing, shoemaking, and carpentry for boys, and for girls, cooking, dairying, laundry work, and sewing. That'll also interest Emma. Oblate priests ran the school with the help of anywhere from 5 or 6 Grey Nuns in the 1880s to 16 or 17 in the post-war period. Probably the best known of them was Sister Helen Grey Eyes, a member of the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, and also the great aunt, is it, Manon, of our own Manon Tremblay. You'll hear more later from Ellen Dobrowolski about Indigenous women like Helen Grey Eyes and Sara Riel, who embraced Christianity and chose a monastic life as essentially missionaries to their own people. I guess I can say it that way. Now, besides the Prairie region, the Grey Nuns of Montreal were especially active in the far north, working in schools and hospitals in several locations near the Arctic Circle. An example is Aklavik, Northwest Territories, about 240 kilometers from the Arctic Ocean. From 1925 to 1959, the Grey Nuns worked at a school they called Immaculate Conception that typically accommodated about 70 Inuit and First Nations children in the 1940s, climbing to over 150. Aklavik had to be moved, environmental reasons, erosion, to a new location. The whole town was moved to Inuvik. And at Inuvik, the federal government established a day school that was affiliated with a Catholic residence or hostel named Grolier Hall, where Grey Nuns were posted from 1959 to 1987, and where many cases of abuse against Indigenous children have been reported by courageous survivors, both in formal proceedings like the sharing panels organized by the TRC and in many other settings, including published memoirs like the one written by Métis lawyer Richard Hardy. So as these examples show, the Grey Nuns were thoroughly committed to the colonizing mission of residential schools and actively engaged in their day-to-day operations for over a century. Many of their former students testified before the TRC, and those accounts provide a deep and immediate sense of the tragedy of the residential school system in Canada. And in the chapter, I devote a paragraph to the testimony of third-generation residential school survivor Joe Whitehawk, who attended 2 schools in Saskatchewan, both staffed by Grey Nuns. And I certainly encourage you to listen to his account, which foregrounds the role of certain nuns he describes as ruthless in the physical and also sexual abuse he endured. A big question for me and for many others on campus is what Concordia might be doing to more fully acknowledge these painful legacies, given the presence of the Mother House on our campus. Following the release of the university's Indigenous Directions Action Plan in 2019, I was invited to join a committee chaired by Manon that was charged with the implementation of recommended action. This is a recommended action out of the Concordia Indigenous Directions Plan 3.6, which was, quote, to undertake critical research on Concordia's history in relation to colonialism, including its founders and founding organizations. Our committee hired Colby Gaudet, who was a PhD student at the time, to prepare a comprehensive independent research report, which he submitted in September 2021 under the title Exploring Concordia's Colonial Past. 4 years later, the university has yet to release that report or act on its recommendations. Concordia has also failed to make a formal statement acknowledging the profound harms done by Jesuits and Grey Nuns to Indigenous children, families, and communities through their involvement in the residential school system. One modest step in the right direction came last year when the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada agreed to Concordia's request for a formal review of the federal heritage designation of the Grey Nuns Mother House. The plaque was quietly removed by a team from Parks Canada last August, pending a review of the designation that might take years. It will take years. And is that enough? And I think many of us will agree that it probably isn't. So take out the probably. I'll conclude by encouraging our university leadership to honor the truth by respecting all of its commitments in a spirit of solidarity and reconciliation. And I look forward to everyone's thoughts later on today as to what that might look like going forward. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Peter. So if my recollection of our order of proceedings is correct, we'll now hear from BK, Leah, and Emma.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I want to just say how much I admire the work that both of you have done and that the Indigenous Directions guidance has really led us towards, I think, some meaningful work in classrooms. We're here, the three of us, as part of a class. It's called Public History. It's the introduction class for a program in public history. Some of you may not know this term, public history. It often involves, for example, how communities work together to learn and communicate their histories. It can be deeply reparative work. It can be commemorative. It can be work that artists, for example, do, or that a community involved in a particular institution may do together. And so in a course that is an introduction to public history, it's a real responsibility, I think, within the institution to be taking that time together to think about how we ask questions, how we listen to one another, how we even approach questions like evidence in our practices. So in my case, I am a Concordia alum, and so I remember moving from Ottawa and driving down the highway and seeing this unusual building, from the, what's that with the balcony, and at the time it was not part of Concordia. And of course, when I returned, it had become so, and so it's very much a learning experience for me too, alongside students, two of whom of 40 some are here. What was interesting with the approach, and I learned this actually while teaching from Colby, I had been to Spanish and been part of the Manitoulin Island Historical Summer Institute. So there had been a really powerful set of conversations, and Louis Debassage, who was on those sort of site visits where we also listened to survivors in the schools, in the Jesuit church as well on Manitoulin, had spoken so powerfully about being a Concordia alum himself, and we had talked a lot about being at Loyola. So it had been a journey, and then to learn alongside each of you, my own journey came through looking into dance histories and bands and so forth. And what I encourage folks to do in the class is really to look at their own practices and begin with what really matters to them. The way we approached this week was not that each person has an assigned piece of history to be working towards, but rather that we look at the city block, which was super interesting, from St. Catherine Street to René Lévesque, and from Saint-Mathieu to Guy, and essentially said, if it's on the city block, you can develop something with this. So we had lots and lots of different narratives. What's really exciting in a room is that we can get together and have one person tell one story of this particular land and its sort of delineation, and another tell another. And together we start to see that we're looking at similar archives, that we're looking at similar photographs, or somebody will bring up material that then affects how another person might ask a question. We were very lucky, and we could look at the slides in a moment. We were very lucky to work for the second half of the class in the visualization studios upstairs in the library building, which allowed students to really create extraordinary, I'd say almost palimpsests of their process. Some people would work with oral history, some people would work with archives, some people would work with talking to family members. There were a whole number of ways that people chose to approach this. And in that way, I was also thinking about what do these students want for their futures, and how are they applying this kind of a process? So in asking the students in the first week, we had lots of people who wanted to become educators. We had lots of people who have artistic practices and want to work for cultural institutions, folks who see themselves as curators, going to law school, et cetera, all of which are implicated in the TRC, and all of which I think really gives them an opportunity to have this time as a community, not per se individually, to look thematically at questions. They worked in small clusters, shared work. If we could look at the slides, that would be great. I went and approached each person to make sure that we have their go-aheads. So the visualization studio, if we move forward one, is a really interesting space. It's absolutely available to make these, essentially it's like 3 screens wide of sort of palimpsests of materials that they're finding from archives. This is Isabella Marcus, a curator and visual artist, who had also been in the dorms and was an international student, was thinking a lot about their trajectory and how do they ask these questions through their practice, through curation, and through inspiration from artists who had interrogated collections in the country, and is currently an international student herself in Spain, so we've been a bit in conversation. But these are from her own drawings of visits, photos of her making art in the dorm room, inspiration from Alex Janvier and other artists who've done interrogative work. This is one of the many examples of ways people approached exploring artworks and exploring archives that allowed them to approach these histories. Maya Bonhomme looked into a family member who she learned had been working with some of the, who also had experienced chronic pain, and looking through the really significant work of women who were unpaid, who were involved in the development of the healthcare infrastructure. And I would add, the Canadian Medical Association, CMA, released its apology while this course was taking place in the fall last year. So there's a real layer of, people tend to say, these are folks who are involved in a difficult history and, on the other hand, built the healthcare system. And I think, how do we begin to say these aren't separate questions, right? There's a real complexity to these layers. And she also, very importantly, I think, was, I'm going to jump around it. She was also very importantly asking questions about what it meant to keep people alive in a Canadian winter, before electricity, in large numbers, providing hospice care amongst other things, and before antibiotics. So she's asking some very profound questions as well about what these infrastructures mean. Another student who's continuing the project. What's great is a lot of the students have gone on to do graduate work in different fields. Léonce, who worked a great deal on the role of some of the nuns in, and this is so close to all of us because of the COVID epidemics, in typhus and other epidemics as well. And what was really, I think, meaningful was to see students in responsible, thoughtful ways do primary source research or do interviews, talk with one another, and really realize that the different narratives they were telling were, in some cases, irreconcilable and complex, and in others helped them really understand things with nuance. And there was a moment where somebody stepped back and said, I think sometimes more than one thing is true at the same time. And I thought that was one of the moments where they approached each other. Here's another example of a student who looked at, amongst other things, music. And so the complexity of what they're bringing to the table, she, as a visual artist, so also worked with storytelling from non-human perspectives through the building. So I want to really leave this to the students to talk a bit about where they moved through. The students in the class were settler and Indigenous, that they asked questions from their locatedness. I don't want to represent other people's stories per se, but I did want to flag how maturely, thoughtfully, lovingly the students were able to approach this together. Can I pass over to you?
Hi. Let's try this again. Okay, there I am. All right. My name is Leah, and I am, in effect, an international student. So the histories of Canada and Montreal in particular are very new to me. So this was a very interesting segue into Canadian history for me, and from a very interesting perspective. And I really enjoyed working with the archives and learning more about the Grey Nuns because it was a very complex history and very complicated, and you know, we're humans and we are those things. We are very complicated. My part of the projects that we worked on were centered around food systems in the Grey Nuns complex. I was really looking at the question of how were these people feeding the engine that moved out into the world and assisted with healthcare and created societies and ran residential schools. And I really got an opportunity to look at a lot of the photographs and in the archives of the lists, the farming lists that they made, and the contracts that they created to buy land and create farms in other parts of Montreal. And I found a lot of interesting things. There was a lot of information about just the products that they were growing, but also about the canning that they did. You could see the preponderance of European products, but very few native products. And you could see that they were still growing those products and using them to fund their work. So they were growing tobacco and tomatoes and corn, but they weren't using them for themselves in the same way that would have been used in Indigenous culture here. So it was a very interesting thing to discover. It was very interesting to see that for all of the work that the Grey Nuns did, they didn't leave a lot behind in terms of recipe books or those kinds of things that really indicated what they were doing with the products that they were using to fuel their works. So that's me.
And having somebody who has experience as a chef looking at recipes and food production, they bring a lot to the others.
So I'm Emma. I was also in this class working with Leah. I'm coming from a fine arts perspective. I recently completed my bachelor's degree here at Concordia in the fine arts department, and I took this class as an elective out of pure interest, personal and academic. I've been working in fiber sculpture, print and painting, all as archival research. So coming to the Grey Nuns, my interest was really initially, where could I find proof of these activities in the archives? Are there photographs of the nuns engaging in fiber arts? And I know that when I say that, not everyone knows what that means, but that encapsulates like textile work and needlework, anything from quilting to embroidery to tufting and beading and more. So I had started going through some of the archives, the Grey Nuns archives at Algoma University, where they had this amazing, amazing collection of photographs. And I kind of fell into this hole where I had made a link between the Grey Nuns and their teaching women's work and homemaking skills to settler women and Indigenous women through Red River, up the Mackenzie Valley, and into the Northwest Territories. And as we were looking at this block where the Grey Nuns Mother House is now, Peter Gossage was a great help in this. I started going through the list of the women buried in the crypt. There are 232 and then about 100 some more, and really got into this question of how do we explore these people's lives and enlighten their orders, considering that Concordia now owns the building. So I have returned to Concordia to complete my master's degree with the history department, working still on this project, completing this archival research into the lives and orders of all these nuns with VK and Peter. And, it was a really great help to be able to engage in this kind of roundtable class format where you're working open-endedly on very complex topics and discussing how to negotiate them in an appropriate and thoughtful way.
Thanks so much to both of you, and the work was really powerful from each of you. I also wanted to flag that each of the other speakers came to the classroom and spoke with them. The library came and spoke with them about where to find resources, how to do that kind of database research and so forth. So it's not just my class, everybody here has done something powerful together.
All right, so thank you to everybody who has presented before me, and thank you everybody here who's in the audience participating with us. So now I'm going to continue this discussion about research and about classes available here at Concordia. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my research. So as Sigwan introduced me, I'm in the Department of Religions and Cultures. I'm a member of the Métis Nation, and so my project focuses on Sara Riel. Yes. So there's my presentation here. So to give a little bit of an introduction into this, I found my whole life growing up and then entering academia is that in discussions about interactions between religious congregations and orders and Indigenous peoples, there's often a desire to simplify the story as much as possible. There's an over-reliance on binaries and dichotomies, and especially this idea that Christianity and indigeneity are completely separate, can never the two meet. And as someone who grew up with Christianity as one of the religious practices of my Métis ancestors, this was something that always didn't resonate as true to me, and instead came across as an attempt of other people to police the way that Indigenous peoples tell our own stories and engage with our own religious traditions. So this project is very special to me, and I think that it really is important to this conversation we're having today because it focuses on complexity. So the title of this presentation is Complex Kinscapes, because I really want to focus on that complexity of letting Indigenous people express the full spectrum of our engagements with Christianity, the good and the bad and everything in between. So my research investigates Sara Riel, who was a Métis Grey Nun, and as Peter said, a missionary to her own people, the Métis. And she, I think, represents really well a sort of case study for investigating the diverse ways that Indigenous people engage with members of Christian missionizing orders and Christianity in general. So, a little bit about Sara Riel. So she also was known as Sœur Marguerite Marie. She was born in 1848 in Saint-Boniface, the Red River Colony, which was a very important settlement in the Métis homeland. She was sister to Métis leader Louis Riel, which I imagine quite a few people have heard about. She attended the Grey Nuns boarding school in Red River as a child, and then joined the order in 1868. After she joined, she served as an educator in and around Red River, and especially at the height of the Red River Resistance, 1869 to 1870. This being when the Métis formed a provisional government in order to establish what is now the province of Manitoba, but had armed conflicts with settlers and military and political confrontations with the federal government. She eventually joined the Oblate mission at Île-à-la-Crosse, which is now located in northern Saskatchewan, and she served at that community as a Grey Nun missionary. So her jobs there were primarily working as an educator and also as what is often referred to as a cultural liaison, which is a very, very complex position that I'll discuss in a little bit more. In 1872, she had miraculous recovery from pneumonia. Her order and the oblates that were present there, her confessor, recognized her recovery as having been a miracle, a genuine miracle. It was sent as proof to Rome in the beatification process of who would eventually become Saint Marguerite Marie, who was the designer of the Sacred Heart emblem. So due to this miraculous recovery, Sara Riel changed her name to Sœur Marguerite Marie. She died in 1883 of tuberculosis at Île-à-la-Crosse. That's an image of the mission at Île-à-la-Crosse there. So that's a little bit about her life. And now we're going to get into some of the complexity that I told you we'd talk about. So, how Sara represents, she's one of several Indigenous women who served as Grey Nuns at this time, and she kind of represents for people this difficult part of discussing Indigenous Christianity and what has sometimes been referred to as quote-unquote positive relations between Indigenous people and Christian missionizing projects. So I'm here to complicate that a bit so we can get into the weeds together. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that Christianity was being practiced in the northwest of Canada, what is now known as Canada, long before the 1840s, which is typically referred to as like the wave of missionizing across the north and west of Canada. This is when the Oblates really set out and started setting up missions. So there are records of Oblate missionaries coming to these areas in the north and west and already finding versions of quote unquote folk Christianities being practiced. So these folk Christianities included things like Catholic rituals such as baptism, prayer services that were being carried out by Indigenous communities themselves without the presence of priests or other members of the clergy. They also found that these versions of Christianity were often quite different than the version that the Oblates were bringing. They were interpreted or adapted to Indigenous worldviews. I highlight Wahkohtowin as a Cree worldview that's also shared by the Métis, that incorporates the ideas of Christianity, of Catholic sort of homeness and family connection being very easily mapped onto that pre-existing worldview. Similarly, there was a lot of adaptation of material culture and other ritualistic practices. So we have a record of this happening. Another important note is that some of these missions that were established across the North and the West were established in response to community requests. Ile-à-la-Crosse was one of these communities that requested for a mission to be set up in order to meet the spiritual needs of the people who were already practicing a form of Christianity. Another important mission that I'll talk about a little bit later is Lac Sainte Anne in Alberta. Some people might know that name because it is also one of the places that Pope Francis visited on his tour, his apology tour of Canada. So the last important point on this slide I want to discuss is the relationship between Oblates, Grey Nuns, and Indigenous community members. So often something that is sort of disregarded in this flattening or simplifying of history is the way that Oblates and Grey Nuns incorporated themselves into the community. How there's often an emphasis on how these congregations and orders changed Indigenous culture and community, but less emphasis on how Indigenous community and culture changed the way that these congregations and orders practiced. So other scholars, Métis scholars of religion like Paul Elgaro and Brenda McDougall, talk a lot about how these missions, they served as community hubs where Indigenous communities, they use these missions as peoplehood places, as places of building community and relations. And sometimes non-Indigenous clergy members they became a part of these community building processes. Most importantly, Brenda McDougall points out Indigenous clergy, like Sara Riel, serving as godparents, becoming a tangible part of these family communities, these family kinship networks. Another thing that's important to point out is how these congregations and orders, they were actively trying to recruit Indigenous members, which there's a lot of difficulty in that, but one thing that's important to highlight is how at this early period, there was a lot of use of Indigenous languages. There was also an emphasis on valuing Indigenous people who would be able to preach to their own people, to be able to translate, and to be able to talk to their own people about the virgins of Christianity that were already being practiced. And then lastly, a difficult and interesting point too is how the Oblates and the Grey Nuns also served as allies in the political and military conflicts of the Métis at this point. And I wanted to highlight this quote from Sister Mary A. Curran, who was a Grey Nun serving in Red River at this time. She wrote to her superior, "Louis Riel has been chosen by God to save his country." So this is the kind of complex relationships that we were dealing with at this point. So keeping all that in mind, these are some questions that are often fielded to me when I tell people about my research. So some frequently asked questions about Sara Riel and the Grey Nuns. So one, why would she join? Especially so often I talked about this dichotomy, this binary where people think that there's no way that an Indigenous person would engage with Christianity in this way. But by her own words, a lot of her letters have been preserved, and she says herself that she was inspired by her family, namely her parents and her brother, but primarily her parents. And she cites her mother as being the influence that told her about God. So she wanted to serve as a nun to continue the religious traditions of her own family. She also wrote a lot about her desire to serve her community and her people, and she wrote often about Catholicism being the religion of her heritage. As much as anything else was a part of her heritage and her culture at Red River, Roman Catholicism also was. So another big question that's asked often is, was there tension around her in her position? And the answer is yes, of course there was, but often in complicated ways. So one of the things that she writes about herself is the uncomfortable position she was put in after the Red River Resistance in 1869, 1870, where she was sort of used as a token to make peace between the Grey Nuns, the Oblates, and the Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba. So due to her position as being a Métis woman who spoke Cree, Michif, English, and French, she would awkwardly be invited to things to sort of try to make the peace after the resistance. Some other sites of tension is that, yes, there was some tension sometimes that happened within the Indigenous community at Île-à-la-Crosse. One example being when she was asked to set up an English class by the Grey Nuns in the Oblates in an attempt to attract more Protestant children to their mission, because the HBC, the Hudson Bay Company workers, their children wouldn't be Catholic. They wanted to attract them with an English class, and the Indigenous community said they would stop going to the school if there was an English class. An example of their issues, of their concerns actually being listened to, is that eventually that class was dropped. And another important thing to point up is that there was a dissent within religious orders and congregations as well. Both VK and Peter have pointed out that the Grey Nuns did an extraordinary amount of unpaid labor for the Oblates, and often that resulted in some tension as well, some unfairness. And there are some examples at Île-à-la-Crosse when the Oblate supervisor wouldn't talk to the Grey Nuns and vice versa over some of the ways that the Grey Nuns were being treated, and also some of the ways that the Oblates were treating the Indigenous community at Île-à-la-Crosse. But inasmuch as there was a lot of tension, another question that it's asked of me a lot is, was there support for Riel? And there absolutely was. One of her main sources of support was from her family, who she wrote to till the end of her life. She received many letters from them talking about how important her role was. Many letters, especially from Louis Riel, talking about how she was his inspiration in his movement. She also received a lot of support from the Red River community. I wanted to highlight this quotation from the newspaper at Red River, Le Métis. And this was written when the news of her departure was announced and the establishment of the mission at Île-à-la-Crosse. So from that article, it says, "Her departure is a sacrifice for her family and the entire population, but at the same time, it is an honor and a blessing for us." And finally, she had a lot of support from the Métis and the First Nations communities at Île-à-la-Crosse. She had close relations with the people that she preached to, that she educated. As I mentioned, she served as a godparent to the community. She served as a godparent 4 times, including to a blood relative who lived there. She also created worship icons of the Sacred Heart to distribute to the Métis families, as that was a veneration that was popular with Métis communities all across the homeland. And I wanted to highlight this quote that was sent. It's from a letter that was sent to Julie Riel, Sarah's mother, after Sarah's death. This is from Sister Agnes, a Grey Nun. She wrote to Julie and said, "People from everywhere came to pray by her body. She was loved and respected as a Métis." So, what Riel reveals, this is from my own research, but I find it's applicable to these difficult conversations when we talk about this legacy and how intertwined Indigenous communities are with Christian missionizing projects. But so what Riel reveals to us is that one, the full breadth of Métis religious practices has always included Christianity. Lots of times she's exceptionalized when people talk about her as being somehow different from her community. But I wanted to point out that while she was an exceptional person, she was not the exception. She became a Grey Nun as a logical continuation of her culture and her faith. She was not in any way separating herself from her Métis-ness, which is something that non-Métis people often make that assumption and write about her becoming a Grey Nun as a way to stop being Métis, whereas in her own words, she was both missionary and Métis. Another thing that she reveals, and other Indigenous Christians, is this idea of Christianity being adapted to Indigenous worldviews, Indigenous onto-epistemologies. And I quote my friend and my supervisor, Paul Garrow, here with the quote, "We made the church our relative." This reveals the close ties that existed between religious orders and the Métis. It contextualizes why Métis people were interested in becoming members of clergy, but it also contextualizes the betrayals that were felt by the Métis. I mentioned how the Grey Nuns and the Oblates were political and military-ish allies, or allies in a political and military conflict in 1869, but in 1885 they abandoned the Métis and instead said that Métis versions, expressions of Christianity were not real Catholicism. This also contextualizes the betrayals of when these mission schools that were originally set up and asked for by the community were converted into residential schools, where the community no longer had any say in what was done to their children. And it also contextualizes ongoing relations between Indigenous Christians and Christian churches, and the very difficult process of trying to get back into good relations when your relative has done you harm. So I wanted to point out this picture. I took this at Lac Sainte Anne when I attended the pilgrimage there, and it was also the day that Pope Francis was speaking. And he's wearing a Métis sash as his vestments here and speaking about how he acknowledged that it might not happen, but he wanted very much for the church and the Métis to be as tightly interwoven as the strands of our sash. So Riel's life and work illustrates the complex web of relations that characterize Métis kinscapes and religious practices. And I have here a very rough and partial depiction of a kinscape. This is a rough and partial depiction of the kinscape of Sara Riel and the many relations that she made in her life. I've highlighted some of the geographic areas where she worked and lived: Red River, Île-à-la-Crosse, the St. Paul settlement in Montana. The red and the purple there, you can see the red names are family names, different Métis family names to whom she was connected. I also have listed the Oblates and the Grey Nuns because she made relations with them. And the purple here, we have Saint-Joseph, Sainte-Marguerite Marie, the Métis Nation itself, all of these different people, entities, ideas, lands that she was a part of, that she had in her family, that she had in her kinscape. So I wanted to conclude here with discussing explicitly why this kind of work, why this understanding is important for us at Concordia and at any other institution that wants to meaningfully address the colonial legacy of its founding and partner institutions. And what I would like to say is that Indigenous people need to be the leaders of these projects, but more than that, people need to listen meaningfully. When you put an Indigenous person, when you want to include Indigenous voices, that means that they actually need to be centered and prioritized. Any attempt to simplify Indigenous kinscapes to look at something like this, of Sara Riel's kinscape, any attempt to simplify it into a dichotomy that is easier for outsiders to understand, it flattens and misrepresents the fullness of Indigenous religious traditions and our processes of making and navigating our own relationality. Religious orders and congregations have historically tried to take possession of these relationships, to claim that the Métis Nation belongs to them, to claim that Indigenous Christians belong to them. And now, too often, we've witnessed other institutions, like educational institutions, trying hard to own and control these histories and these practices. Relationships cannot be owned or controlled, but are created and co-constituted together. And we've heard from the other participants in these relationships. We've heard from the church, we've heard from Concordia and other institutions that now are a part of these relationships. But in order to understand these relations fully, or I say even at all, Indigenous voices and perspectives need to be heard and listened to without trying to simplify or control the fullnesses of our experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone on the panel, for, again, sharing your knowledge and perspectives and contributing to this very complicated, multifaceted conversation here. And so we're going to finish by playing or sharing a video that both Portia and Catherine created last year. Within-ish?
Oh, yeah. Oh, I can.
I know you have their statement prepared, right? But I can give a tiny bit of context to it. This video was also produced in a class offered by my department, the Department of Religions and Cultures, that was in Decolonizing the Local. So they first produced that last fall 2024. But then I had the the honor and privilege and great joy of teaching Catherine in a class just in winter 2025, Indigenous Religions, or Religion and Indigenous Traditions, another class offered by my department, the Department of Religion and Cultures. And in that class, Catherine, with Portia's permission, but Portia couldn't be there herself, but Catherine presented this video to our class as well. In both classes, we included tours of the Grey Nuns building, specifically the chapel. So this video was first made by Portia and Catherine in response to that trip that they took in decolonizing the local. And then Catherine presented the experience of making it and her and Portia's sort of goals in making it in the class that we shared together in winter 2025.
Thank you for helping me out with this part. And so Portia and Catherine, while they couldn't be here, they did send us notes just to introduce their project in their own words. And so I'll just share with you what they wanted to share with everyone if they were able to be here in person. And so Portia Lafond and Catherine Naquado stand as trailblazers within their families, being the first generation to break free from the cycle of residential and boarding schools. Last fall, in their Decolonizing the Local class at Concordia University, they grappled with a painful history of residential schools and the Grey Nuns' troubling role in the colonial assimilation of their Cree and Atikamekw communities. Their discovery of the university's efforts to uphold the Grey Nuns' images as mothers to all feels like a deep betrayal, especially considering the absence of any apology or acknowledgement regarding its involvement in the residential school system. The shadows of colonialism linger within Concordia, leaving Portia and Catherine feeling profoundly disillusioned. So during the filming of their final project, their endeavors to engage with the chapel, including a tobacco offering ceremony, were met with dismissive and uninformed responses by the chapel staff. This experience not only left them feeling defeated, but also highlighted the broader systemic failure to respect and recognize Indigenous peoples and their traditional healing practices. When their initial footage of the offering mysteriously disappeared at the 56-second mark, it served as a striking metaphor for the ongoing barriers and continuous silencing inflicted by the Grey Nuns against Indigenous healing and accountability. Yet, through both of their unwavering commitment to ceremony, reflection, and cultural practices, they found the strength to reclaim their space, honor their ancestors, and assert their rightful presence as Indigenous students demanding to be heard. Their artistic expressions are not merely acts of resistance. They are vital connections to their roots, empowering them to embrace their identity as Indigenous peoples navigating through colonial landscapes. And so we'll finish off our panel by watching this video, and then we'll have some discussion open for everyone here. So, bye.
Seem to be experiencing some technical difficulties. I'm not sure it's playing, and yet not. Okay, we're just getting that reset up again. So just in a moment here, we'll press play.
Indeed. I think we do better. Okay. So I'll just take another second again to thank everyone, miigwech, for coming and sharing again everything that you have been working towards learning over the past many years. I just want to say that if you have any questions that you would have liked to pose to either Portia or Catherine, Ellen has graciously offered to answer any questions towards that as best as Ellen can as well. And so we have the rest of the time. I think this is about half hour, 31 minutes, 30 now, it just switched, for conversation with the audience. If you have any questions, we introduced a lot of different topics of history, of research, of Indigenous presence within these buildings as well. And how do we work towards something better, doing something better as a Concordia community? And so I'll leave it open to everyone. I think there is a microphone going around right here. And yeah, just.
If you do have a question, please just raise your hand. I'll get this microphone to you. And for those of you joining us on Zoom, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat and we'll be sure to read them out, or you can request to turn on your video. So are there any questions?
Yay, first. I was just curious about the significance of the red item that they were putting on the door and there. So, because I'm new here, so I'm just like trying to understand. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that was a tobacco tie. So it's something that's used in prayer and healing. And every nation has its own specific ways of using tobacco, but it's something that's quite more or less universal across Turtle Island, the what we now call North America. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
Hi, can you clarify what courses you teach in case for the people who would like to take the courses that you've mentioned? And another thing is the Grey Nuns, the crypts, are they open to the public? Is that a way to visit that? And are they unmarked graves? Like, do they have any names, or are they just like they look also in from the picture of Mark Miller, child killer? They look very small. So are they of like kids, or are they nuns in there? Thank you.
Thanks for that question. How to answer? I mean, I'm retiring next year, so I mean, maybe your questions are about what courses VK and Ellen are teaching are great ones. The crypt it's a strange place because it's not actually owned by Concordia. It continues to be owned by a trust, put it that way, with representatives of the Grey Nuns, the Archdiocese of Montreal, and Concordia. I've taken students for tours in there many times, and it used to be you just had to get clearance from the Concordia authorities, but just last year they started imposing kind of an appeal to the Grey Nuns because technically they're also part owners still, and that's kind of a complicated part of the way the building was acquired, and it has to do with the way that it turned out to be impossible to exhume the graves for public health reasons. They are mostly nuns, mostly from the 19th century. And as you get more recent, and Emma's been working to document this in all its aspects, but as you get more into more recent history, meaning around the turn of the 20th century, so 1890s, 1910s, around in there, it tends to be mostly the superiors, people that had positions of authority within the Grey Nuns, who were buried there because it was seen as prestigious to be buried there because, of course, the remains of the foundress of the Grey Nuns, Sainte Marguerite Duville, were there. And so to be close to the saintly foundress was a sign of great prestige and respect. And whether Concordia should have a graveyard in the basement of its main downtown residence is another question we could get into. I have my own views on that, but And anybody else, you want to speak to your courses or to other aspects, or Emma on the crypt?
Yeah, well, I guess in terms of who's buried down there and the crypt, the graves. The way that it's organized, there are the crosses with the names of the people who are buried. It doesn't seem to be clear whether or not that is organized underneath or not. But I can definitely tell you that there are, as Peter said, many Mother Superiors buried there, many women who worked in public health with various epidemics. And in the research that I had done last year for VK's class, I had discovered 24 women through cross-referencing with published texts by the Grey Nuns that were involved in one way or another with the residential school system. Now that involvement varies from person to person, and there aren't accounts that I have found about what those specific people have done or what their roles were, but the majority of those women in the index that I had compiled were Mother Superiors who had in some way a hand in negotiating for funding, visiting, etc. And then 4 people who were foundresses. Two were foundresses, one was a headmistress, and one had helped prepare the land to build on, but died very soon after arriving and was shipped back to Montreal. Does that kind of answer your question about who's buried in the crypt?
Just one moment.
Kind of, because well, I'm from the south of this continent, so I'm like also learning the actual history of here, and I'm learning that in a lot of this like residential schools, like places where indigenous children were taken, like a lot of these kids died of neglect or were killed, and that they are often buried underneath the property. So that's why I was like, oh, do they have a crypt for the kids, or do we know if there's any like bodies in? I don't know. Sorry, trigger warning also. Like, have we searched that area? Because I was.
The names that we have documented that are documented for the area that is under the Mother House are really benefactors, so people who donated or had lived at the Mother House, and then women of status who were working there. Do you want me to pass back to you?
And I would just say, that is an important piece of your question has to do with unmarked graves at residential schools. Of course, the Grey Nuns Mother House wasn't a residential school, but it was kind of the nerve center, the headquarters for this, network of schools. But it seems to me that when I see news reports about searches in schools out west, I'm always looking to see if it was one of the Grey Nun schools, and there have been at least 3 where in the last 5 or 10 years where the Catholic Church ran this school. That's usually what you're seeing in a Canadian Press report or something along those lines. But because we have this kind of deeper knowledge, we're able to say, well, yeah, that's a school where the Grey Nuns were involved right from the beginning. So this is part of the legacy as well. But I think the records are pretty well kept for the crypt. They have a very detailed list of who was buried there. Part of it is that the Grey Nuns moved into that building in the 1870s. They had a previous mother house that's in Old Montreal and actually exhumed a lot of the people that were buried there. And so, there's something like, you might call it a mass grave in there, where people had been moved from a previous resting place. So I hope that answers a little bit. Thank you.
And to answer your other question about classes, So in my department, the Department of Religions and Cultures, I've mentioned 2 classes. One that I got to be a teaching assistant for, that was Decolonizing the Local, and that was also the course that Catherine and Portia produced that video project for. And the course that I got to teach just last school year was Religion and Indigenous Traditions, which was great, which was wonderful to teach. And I hope that my department will keep expanding on this and produce more courses. But I'll let you guys speak about history, yeah?
Yes, I will. It's an introduction to public history. It's 306, and it'll be again in the winter.
Oh, right. I keep forgetting I have mine here. For First People Studies, you're one of my students, so you know that conversations like this, it's threads through all of our courses basically, and so this is technically our class here too. And so I was really happy to see everyone come out for this kind of conversation. And I don't think our program has classes specifically geared towards this. We work with Department of Religion and Cultures for most of this bigger kind of focused conversations. But again, this topic comes up in a lot of our classes because it's still very much present in our daily lives, I think. And so, yeah.
And yeah, another thing to add, this isn't a course, but I was like, oh, this is a good idea, good opportunity to bring up this other thing that I've thankfully been asked to be a part of. It's the Step Forward program. Step Forward is leadership development program for Concordia student employees. And they received some funding, a grant last year. And one of the things that the students requested was a campus tour from an Indigenous perspective, talking about the colonial history of Concordia. So over the summer, I worked on developing that tour using largely Colby's report that they produced for Concordia, the one that hasn't been fully published or released yet, and also using Peter's chapter on the Mother House, and also using course materials that were provided me by Dr. Norman Raven, who was the one who taught Decolonizing the Local, and my own materials from the course that I taught. And so over the summer, I developed that walking tour. Hopefully, we're looking for a place where it can be housed permanently by the university now. But it is a tour that goes around all of these buildings and to the Grey Nuns building. And then we take the Concordia shuttle to Loyola and visit all of these places on campus to talk about kind of everything that we've discussed today. So the fact that that was an initiative that was requested by the students is really wonderful. And that Step Forward found the funding to make it happen, again, is something that is fantastic. So I'm happy to see that these projects are bubbling up. You know that there is a desire and a need. People who are a part of this educational community want more emphasis on this. We need more emphasis on this. So, I mean, as we continue on with this day, then we can continue thinking about where do we go from here? What are next steps? And how do we keep applying the right kind of pressure to make sure that they happen?
One question for the guy there, Colby. He mentioned about getting access, or if they want to do, students want to do research. Basically, like they're trying very hard to keep it secret or not have access to the archives. Is there something being done to have more access with these archives?
Thank you. That's a really great question. It's something I've been thinking a lot about since working with this material, because I realize working in archives, just based on my own experience as a grad student, I can see the sort of the skills and the confidence that I've developed personally in how to work with archives. So I realize that it can be an intimidating thing to, if you have an interest in this history, to want to learn more about it. The research I've been doing was at the Jesuit archives, which are in Montreal. They're on the north side of Parc Jarry. In my experience with the Jesuit archives, they were very interested in nurturing research relationships. When I contacted them and expressed interest in reviewing this material, I was able to visit them. They did ask me about Indigenous communities, like if I had developed any kind of relationships with people from communities that perhaps were affected by the Jesuits and the residential school whose materials I was looking at. So in terms of the Jesuit archives, they're certainly open to building relationships with communities. Before I left Concordia just this past year, I began some conversations with people at Concordia in different departments across my department, history, Indigenous directions, and First People Studies, to try to coordinate some kind of event that could bridge Indigenous students at Concordia community members who perhaps have some kind of connection to the residential school history and the Jesuit archives. I wasn't able to accomplish that before I left Montreal, but it is an ongoing interest that I have, just because I've developed personal relationships with the Jesuit archives. So if I can help in any way, create those bridges. I certainly take your point that it is a problem in terms of accessibility, and there's often a lot of parties involved to kind of make those connections. So for the time being, if any of you here, watching this event have interest in the Jesuit material and want to kind of know how you might access it, I'm certainly willing to give you the information that I have. But I can tell you, if you email the Jesuit archives, go to their website and email them, especially if you are from a community that has connections to these schools, you should be able to receive help and assistance and advice from them on how to access the archives. And they are public archives in the sense that you do have to make an appointment, but anyone, you don't have to be a scholar or a student to visit, but it is sort of by appointment. So just to kind of draw my comments to a close, I think it's a very important project and one that would take time. But if any of you are interested in making connections with the Jesuit archives, I'm even willing to kind of make the email introductions between the archivists there and people who are interested in perhaps for the first time visiting the material in person. So I thank you for your question, and by all means, send me an email and I can kind of connect you with that information.
Thanks, Colby.
Hi, I have a question for Sigwan Thivierge. I know that your goal is centered around linguistics and reclaiming your language by going home and also with your knowledge in linguistics. And I would like to know if you have any plans of when you learn Anishinaabe sorry, do you have any plans on teaching that language to your community or making a class? I'd like to know.
Yeah, that's my dream, I think. Well, part of my dream too is just the goal anyway, is that one day I'll be able to talk with our grandparents in Anishinaabe. Because talking with him over the past few years and strengthening those family connections again, it's been incredibly healing, I think, for both of us. And I'm seeing the effects that reclaiming our language, it knits our family back together, knits our communities back together, and our nations back together too. Kind of alongside all of this work that I'm doing, it's our communities, the Algonquin and Anishinaabe community. There's about 9-10 of us on the Quebec side. There's much more on the Ontario side also. And in Quebec, we're split between French and English speaking, and I see the effects of not a different kind of colonialism, another strand of colonialism and how it separated us all together. And I see Anishinaabe as a way to get us back to working towards our collective goals again. And for me, it starts within our family. It starts by just us, by just talking, us siblings, family talking together again. And so I'm here at Concordia to start this work. I teach FPST 310, Intro to Algonquian Linguistics, every winter. And I'm trying to use linguistic patterns and processes as much as I can to show that all of us, we can reclaim our languages and we can speak them together again. And that's just the beginning, I think, to offer these kinds of language teaching, language sharing spaces under the rubric of a course code and a course credit. But I'm also working on Saturdays throughout the weekends to have a more conversational-based language learning space also. And then in the summers, I want to start language camps, and I want to work towards language nests and really bring our languages to the forefront of these academic spaces, but also more importantly within our own families and within our own nations, because I don't think our languages should live in institutions like this. They were kind of taken out because of institutions like this. And so it's here to kind of undo the effects, decolonize what has been done to us. And I see my role as also undoing the effects of these institutions and systems that have done a lot to break us down. And so, yeah, for me, the language, our languages, whatever they are, it's a way for us to bring ourselves back together, to strengthen us, and to, yeah, to do better, I think. And so that's my answer to you. Thank you. Does anyone have any other questions in the last 8 minutes that we have? Oh, yeah.
Hi. So this question is for all of you. I would just like to know, the Vatican had refused to release or have the general public have access to their archives. And I have a friend who is also a 60 Scoop survivor, and he has trouble accessing adoption records from the prairies, social services. So I don't understand how you all are able to access archival material. So could you explain what's the difference? Like how is it that you all have access and my friend has trouble?
Sure, yeah, excellent question. One of the things is that these different institutions and organizations operate completely independently of each other. So like I've done some archival work at the Grey Nuns archives. So, but they're their own separate thing. Even other Catholic congregations, orders, they don't operate together. Like the Jesuit archives are separate from the Grey Nuns archives, are completely separate from provincial archives, from federal archives, from the Vatican archives. It really is a mess. And it's hard not to think that mess, it may have not been created intentionally, but it's sort of maintained sometimes to make things harder for people. It does feel that way. But so just a little bit my experience with working with the Grey Nuns archives, like as Colby said, there's an introduction that's made. Peter was my liaison who put me in contact with the archives there. I had to go in person and explain what my project was and write justification for why I was there and what I wanted to do. So this is the thing too, is that these archives are private. Again, federal and provincial government ones are different in lots of cases. I know people's adoption records were destroyed, which again, I mean, that's worth investigating why provinces and the federal government thought that it was a good idea to destroy people's adoption records. But anyhow, returning to the Grey Nuns, I had to write justification for what my project was and why I should be given access. And then they looked at it and they decided, yeah, you can come in and do this. So of course, I don't know what the decision-making process is behind that, but I mean, we can speculate potentially that I'm a Métis person writing about another Métis person, but also a Métis person who represents that order in a way that they like to be represented, that congregation rather. So there is always this question, you're never entirely sure if you're going to get permission. A lot of it depends on who you are, who you know, what your project is. And in the case of government archives, that's a whole other many cans of many worms. Would you like to talk more about that?
I guess if part of the question is sort of how do we move forward in the, in cases where archives say no, and I can speak to that a little bit, because with the Grey Nuns, when I approached them in 2020, it was really about finding out more about the schools and what records did they have. I was imagining they would have student registers and all kinds of, detailed information about each school. I was given a hard no on that. You're not going to look at any of those records, but we'll give you these summaries that we've prepared of the history of our schools that are actually kind of, they double as kind of finding aids, that if you had this narrative, you could go into the archives and sort of find your way around. But what I was able to do was to kind of cross-reference those individual narratives that I was allowed to see for each school with the incredibly rich and voluminous materials that are available at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which is the survivor, or the the kind of the survivor institution post TRC, right? So, I mean, there are things there that you can't learn. You're not going to see, student registers and individual student files, but there's a lot of material there. So it's kind of a workaround when you do hit the kind of roadblocks, and the process that was explained to me. I mean, there's an archivist at the Grey Nuns Archives who's a professional archivist, but she answers directly to the Mother Superior and to a council of nuns who want to kind of continue, being careful. They'll tell you that, this is a matter of ongoing litigation. We can't show you those files. Another thing that was said to me was kind of, that again, haven't we shared our archives enough, which was very frustrating and surprising for me. So for me, it's been a kind of finding workarounds, but the NCTR archives are really important from that perspective.
I was wondering, actually, I don't know, technical people, is there any way we could put up this website of the archives so people can see? Because it is a really, really great resource. Yeah. It's one that I've recommended to people. It really is one of the most comprehensive, but even with that, there's always the asterisk that sometimes, it's hard to put everything that's related in one place. And also sometimes different archives intentionally withhold. It's part of the design to make it inaccessible. But this is a really great resource if we can get it up. But VK, you had something else?
In terms of the students doing the research, I think it really depended by topic. So once you end up with healthcare or government stuff, it's very different. My own research is much, much earlier, some of that material than you find in other countries. So some of that was then done in France. And it's amazing to see the difference between like the public national institution and the colonial archive, which is very, very difficult to work through. So, bureaucratic procedure shapes results in really important ways. And it's also, I think, meaningful when a group of students are working together and encountering such archives in different ways for them to share what it is that they're experiencing, because then you see it more clearly, what's easily accessible, what's more complex, and how are the different organizations and orders negotiating publicness.
Okay, so it's 12:29, and I think that's all the time that we have left. I had something I wanted to say. As it's kind of like coming back to me. I'll just thank everyone again for coming and that's what I wanted to do, for setting the stage for this day-long conversation that we're going to be having, specifically the history of residential schools and day schools, and just what today represents of a discussion of truth and reconciliation. And so starting the conversation from here at Concordia with the buildings that are on our campus, the buildings that we go into and live into. My own office overlooks the Grey Nuns building. And so every morning I'm kind of like, have a little bit of reaction. And so I'm happy and I'm relieved also to see that members of our own community are bringing these conversations forward, having these conversations, talking about this report. It's one of the worst kept secrets by now, right? And just making sure that we're keeping ourselves accountable as a community, as an institution. And so I'll end it here. I know we're coming back afterwards for another panel that I really hope that everyone will still be here for and to come back for it. I think this is really important to talk about ourselves also, lived experiences, how we as Indigenous peoples have moved through these spaces and continue moving through these spaces, and just, kind of not a great elegant way to finish that with just a but I hope you get the sense and spirit of what I mean by something like that. And so miigwech again for all of our panelists, miigwech for all of our audience, and just another big clap for everyone.
Okay, thank you so much, Sigwan. Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll leave the Zoom running because another event starts again at 1:30. You should be back for that. But we will be closing up the live stream, but just know this remains available on our YouTube channel and you should revisit and you should reshare it.